Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty getting our moderator in by Zoom, but hopefully he'll be joining us shortly. We're very glad to see you at today's Davis Center Book Talk. Today's event is extra special because we get to welcome back one of our alumni, Charles Hecker, to share his work in the field, and more specifically to talk about his new book, Zero Sum: The Arc of International Business in Russia, newly published by Oxford University Press. You might have noticed on your way in that there are copies for sale just outside this room. We hope you'll avail yourself of one or two, early stocking stuffers, whatever it might be. We also have put a QR code on the table over there, just in case you haven't joined the Davis Center mailing list yet. It is the most efficient way to learn about our 100+ events that we hold year in and year out. We will soon, I hope, have the pleasure of having Davis Center associate and member of our advisory board, Craig Kennedy, on Zoom to serve as a discussant, but that we're still working on that. Craig was actually meant to be here in person, but an injury has sidelined him and kept him home. So hopefully he'll be online shortly. I will go ahead and talk about Craig anyway, even though he's not here, and say that Craig is also a Harvard alum, having received both his bachelor's degree in Slavic languages and literatures and his PhD in history here. He spent 20 years advising corporate clients, first at Morgan Stanley and then at the Bank of America, before spending time in the nonprofit sector as chairman of the Pushkin House in the UK. Most recently, Craig has returned to researching Russia's oil and gas industry, as well as looking at the impacts of sanctions on those commodities. So I did want to also say that we are recording today's session, and in fact, we are live streaming right now on YouTube, specifically for our RICA alums, our RICA alumni, Charles himself being a RICA alum. So if you have questions for Charles and you're tuning in via YouTube, please go ahead and ask them via the YouTube chat function. And now I will do a brief bio for Charles. Charles Hecker has spent 40 years traveling and working in the Soviet Union and Russia. He's worked as a journalist at the Miami Herald and the Moscow Times, and as a geopolitical risk consultant at Control Risks, where he was a partner in the firm. While at Control Risks, Charles helps dozens of leading international companies invest safely in Russia and manage the dynamic array of risks the country presented as it developed as a market. From 2000 to 2008, he was the managing partner of Control Risks' Moscow office. He is a regular contributor to Monocle Radio and has offered expert commentary on Times Radio, CNN, the BBC, CNBC, and Bloomberg TV, amongst others. A fluent Russian speaker, obviously, having worked in Moscow for so long, he holds an undergraduate degree in Russian and Soviet studies from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree, as I've mentioned already, from the Russian Research Center, which is what the Davis Center was formerly called. Charles grew up in Connecticut, the suburbs of New York City, with a brief stint in South Bend, worth including in your bio for sure. He's also lived in Miami and Moscow and is currently residing in London. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Charles to talk about his new project.
Chris, thank you. And thank you to everybody in the room, and thank you to everybody online. I am in the very fortunate position of actually wanting to start with quite a long list of thank yous. But just actually to start by saying what an honor, what a pleasure, what an absolute joy it is really to be back at Harvard, to be at the Davis Center, to be in Cambridge. Thank you for the nice weather. Thank you for the very, very warm welcome. It's genuinely a place that I always just feel so good being here, for the environment and the atmosphere and for all the people at the Davis Center. Specific thank yous to Natasha Yefimova-Trilling, to Donna Griesenbeck, to Nina Wright, to Chris Martin, to Laura Sargent. And I do want to say a huge thank you, and hoping that he makes it, to Craig Kennedy.
I don't know.
And if he's not here, if Craig isn't here on the screen, he'll be here in spirit, because he and I had two enormously compelling conversations over the past couple of days in preparation for the presentation. And I learned an enormous amount just talking to Craig in prep for today's session. So I'm grateful for those conversations, and I hope my remarks will reflect some of the content that Craig and I discussed. And I was just very grateful to him for even making himself available to join us today. So that's out of the way. There's one other thing that I need to get out of the way, and that is that I have learned a very important lesson, and that is never, ever, ever prepare a presentation on Russia more than 24 hours in advance. When the Davis Center invites you to speak, you prepare. You start getting ready and you get your ducks in a row as early as you can. And then it sort of all goes sideways because news and current events and geopolitics always manages to outstrip you. And I think we're back in one of those geopolitical periods where, you wake up in the morning and you log on to whatever you like to log on to, and you find out how much the world has changed while you were asleep. And just anecdotally, I've been here exactly a month on a long, long book tour. And I got off the plane in New York on the 28th of February, turned on my phone, and everyone said, have you seen what happened to Zelensky in the Oval Office? So while I was flying over here, he was in the Oval Office. And it's been ever since then, it's just really been sort of nonstop. I am accidentally very fortunate that the US publication, early comment on the book. I'm delighted that Christine Jacobson is here. I'm just so happy as a fellow alumnus. I'm just delighted that Christine's here. I'm fortunate, but accidentally fortunate, in that the US publication date of Zero Sum was at the very beginning of March, when geopolitics between US and Russia did their usual sort of whiplash-inducing 180-degree turn. And ever since then, it's really been a day-to-day story. And with each book talk, I've had to sort of rip the script up and start more or less from scratch. Briefly, a little bit about the book. It's not a memoir. I'm not really in the book. It's based on interviews with more than 70 executives, analysts, diplomats, academics, some very generous contributions from Harvard scholars in the book that I'm very grateful for, from Alexandra Vacru and from Rawi Abdulal. I cornered them when I was here for the 75th anniversary, and they were very generous in their remarks. And all of these people have really made the book come to life, and all of them have, on-the-ground experience in Russia. I won't go into huge amounts of detail beyond that, just to say that the book contains sort of lessons learned and not learned over the past 30 years of doing business in Russia and over the past 3 years of our experience with international investment in Russia. And I'll start with some of those lessons. And since this is meant to be a sort of compact presentation, I'll only go into 2 of them. If at any point in this talk I start to sound like I'm being judgmental, well, okay, I might slip into that a little bit. I don't mean to be. I make no judgments about company behavior in Russia. Maybe we can reserve that for a time a little bit in the more distant future. Companies are going to do what companies do, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. I think we might feel a little bit more free to get out the judgment stick for companies that go back and make the same mistakes twice. So think about that as we carry on. Super brief outline. The book starts in 1991 when international investors piled into Russia. Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. International investors piled into Russia in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that this is one of the book's earliest lessons or earliest paradoxes. And that is, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation was politically rudderless, suffering from absolutely neck-breaking hyperinflation, and was rampantly criminalized. And the international investment community, the business community, said, let's go to Russia. So, we can talk about that as well. The book ends more or less in 2022 with the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, when investors essentially stampeded out of the country with almost, but not quite, the same volume and the same velocity that they stampeded in just 30 years ago. There's a chapter on international business in Russia in the Tsarist period. There's a chapter on international investment in the Soviet period. These are much more interesting than you would think. And the book ends with a couple of chapters on the geopolitics of going back to Russia, and then really the geopolitics of global company activity altogether. But now that we've seen a full cycle of businesses entering and exiting Russia, and now considering re-entering Russia. I thought we'd just check in on two of the themes in the book. To a certain degree, Zero Sum is about the way companies and countries interact. And here's one of the things that I learned as a consultant, but also while I was reporting the book. And that is that companies look at countries as markets and not as political or geopolitical entities. And I think that the world has caught up with the companies that fail to realize that the places that they do business carry both political risk and geopolitical risk, are not just markets. I mean, for those of you who have worked inside large organizations, you will hear companies use terms like EMEA or Asia Pac or LATAM for the places that they do business. And these abbreviations, coined at a period of very rapid globalization, what they do is they gloss over the borders that divide up those regions or those markets. And the frictionless, borderless trade that globalization promised us has essentially gone fairly sharply in reverse. And I think even before this sort of shift into reverse gear, you could argue that things, the universe can only expand up to a certain point before it starts to contract again. And I think that globalization was really reaching the end of its elasticity probably quite a number of years ago. But now I think it's going fairly sharply into reverse. And so, this has caught out the companies that really fail to realize that they're not just working in markets, but they're working in countries. After Crimea, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, for example, there's an anecdote in the book, two anecdotes, two vignettes in the book. One was with an American executive and one was with a German executive. And the American executive said, after Crimea, said, geopolitics is bad, but business is really good. So that's one. The second was with a German executive who was the CEO of his company's Russian subsidiary. And same thing, after Crimea, his bosses get on the phone from Berlin and they're, yelling down the phone at him and saying, this is horrible. What's happened in Crimea is just awful. It's dreadful. We're in shock. But can you please increase your sales figures for next year? So, have we learned our lessons on this? And in a session this afternoon, a career session with some of Rika's potential and existing students, we talked about, what did companies see? When did they see it? And what did they do about it? Something I talked about with Craig a lot also. And the answer is sort of certain things sometimes. Which kind of leads me to another theme in the book. Actually, before I get to that, there are companies doing business right now in Iraq. There are companies doing business right now in Sudan. There are companies doing business in politically sensitive and risky parts of the world everywhere. And companies will determine that on their own. And so the fact that they're in Russia or the fact that they're in China, these are all highly individualistic decisions that companies make in highly idiosyncratic ways. But here's the second lesson, or the second theme that I just wanted to touch on briefly. And Chris, please cut me off when I start to talk too long.
Keep going.
When people talk about their books, they tend to never stop. I really do hope you buy the book, but by the end of the session, you won't need to. So for years, probably for too long, the West just assumed that with enough time and with enough money, that Russia would eventually, more or less, turn into a place that looked a lot like us. And this was in part, I'm glad to see nodding heads in the background. That's always very reassuring. Thank you for that. This is in part the assumption that we were making about every society at the time. This is the end of history argument, that the world was headed towards a place where every country would be a liberal democracy with an open market. And, the additional assumption that liberal democracies and market economies were twins and could not be separated and had to happen together at the same time. I think we've learned that assumption hasn't held. And then there was a final assumption that we were making, part of this kind of basket of political evolutionary assumptions, and that is what happens to countries when they develop a middle class. And that is that the development or the emergence of a middle class in an emerging market or in any country is supposed to predict or foretell of an evolution in their legal system, that's supposed to protect the interests of this emerging middle class. And what does an emerging middle class want? It wants to be able to preserve and protect its wealth and pass it on to the next generation. So it just never seemed to work in Russia. It just didn't seem to happen. I think we know where electoral democracy went, and you can say it went in 93, or maybe in 95, or maybe with the presidential elections of 96. And I think we also know where economic reform went in Russia. And for those of you who read the sensational declassified memo in December of just last year, written by Wayne Merry, who is an analyst in the American embassy in Moscow and sent to Washington through the Dissent channel, Wayne Merry said, look, we are trying to ram a capitalist square peg into a Russian round hole, and we're getting economic reform in Russia very badly wrong. And his career was essentially destroyed by that memo. History has judged him, I think, quite favorably and quite kindly. What's interesting is that when his memo was declassified, thanks to the efforts of a group in Washington, D.C., the State Department's response to his memo was also declassified. And it was the only time and the first time that he ever got to read what the State Department thought of that cable that he sent in 1994. So, this is where we get a bit judgy. We made a series of assumptions about Russia from the very beginning, and then we didn't challenge them. We didn't challenge them often enough, and we didn't challenge them robustly enough. Really, rather than being judgmental, I'm trying to be fairly pragmatic about this. These are things that we all, whether we're in the world of business or not, these are things that we should always be doing. The other thing I have to inject at this point in the conversation is that I'm trying hard, it may not seem this way, but I'm trying hard, and everybody in the book, we tried really hard to use hindsight sparingly. This is what happens when you write a book about things that took place in the past. Daniel Satinsky, author of a similar period in Russia, in a similar situation. We used hindsight, you can't ignore it, but we tried to use it fairly sparingly. And then just lastly on this topic, maybe it's time that we think a little bit, we change our expectations about companies. We want companies to have the same values as us, or the same morals as us. That's the way we choose our friends. Can't choose your relatives, but that's the way we choose the relatives that we like. And that's the way you want to choose the companies that you do business with, but you can't always do that. Not sure. The jury is out on how we want companies to behave in that respect. Let's talk about the future a little bit and move on. So the starting gun, at least in the United States, for the potential return of international business to Russia was a phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin in mid-February, and then the meeting in Riyadh between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh. We thought that those talks would focus fairly narrowly on a ceasefire in Ukraine. But as the principals left the room, Rubio and Lavrov, they said things that indicated that the conversation was of a much broader nature. And they used expressions like economic engagement and things like that. And really what I should be saying is that the starting gun for all of this began in November when Trump won the elections. He promised to resolve the war in 24 hours. Those 24 hours have yet to materialize. But to the business community, that sort of talk starts to smell like sanctions relief. And not too long after the inauguration, in fact, there was a story in the FT that said that European EU energy heads are preparing to buy more Russian gas. That went off like a bomb in Europe. And then, we've had another Putin-Trump phone call, and we've had another visit in Riyadh. No agreements, lots of shifting terms and conditions, lots of things to sort of pin hopes to, but not really to count on very much. And at every stop in this book tour, people have come up to me and said that their companies are talking about going back to Russia. Not every company will, but in the United States, I believe quite firmly that everyone's talking about it. There's been lots of coverage on this that say companies aren't talking about it. There's been lots of coverage that says companies are talking about it. There's coverage in the media that says people will do it, but they'll do it much more cautiously. All I know is that it seems to be on everybody's lips. It's probably wise not to anticipate the kind of stampede back that we had in 1991. But companies are going to go in, which raises an interesting question. Who now looks smart? The companies that left or the companies that stayed? And, we can talk about that maybe separately. So what does this drive to re-engage with Russia tell us? What kind of companies or why would anyone want to expose themselves once again to the level of pain that they experienced when they exited the market over the past 3 years? And there's some reasonable detail from a consultant who was helping people with the exit process. I mean, control risks help people with the exit process to a certain degree, but there was a guy who was negotiating the sort of the reallocation of assets in the sort of exit committee at Kremlin level, and he describes the whole process as a mosh pit. And somebody at a previous book event said, "Is Unilever still in Russia?" Unilever left just a few months ago, and is probably now still putting burn ointment on its skin. But companies will go back. So there are probably 3 groups, speaking broadly, of companies that will go back or won't go back. And the first is, no surprises here, natural resources, energy, mining, metals, minerals. These companies will probably go back. These are companies that have the institutional resilience and fortitude, the cast iron stomachs that you need to swallow risk in Russia. And these are companies that can only go where the resources are, and they have built in the mechanisms that they need to manage that. There will be many, many more companies that play wait and see. A banker friend of mine said to me, "We want to go back to Russia, but we're going to let somebody else go first." Okay, that's interesting. And one of the things that I learned in consulting and in reporting the book is that companies get FOMO. And as soon as one company makes a move back in a sector, like in banking, my friend in the banking sector said, "Well, we're going to wait for somebody else to go." So if that company goes and, the water is fine, something worth a lot of discussion separately, everyone else will want to go back. And then finally, I've also heard, anecdotally and personally, that there are companies who've said, "Never again, no way, not our cup of tea." And that's, we'll see how long that decision lasts. But there are companies who were long-term investors in Russia who said, we're out forever. Next question. What kind of Russia is waiting for the companies that do go back? The war has lasted much longer than any of us forecast. And so much change has taken place on the ground in Russia that, it's a dramatically, legally, financially, politically, commercially, it's a much different place really than just even 3 years ago. So some companies will expect to trigger the buyback agreements that they embedded in their exits. And, famously, McDonald's has a 15-year buyback clause. Starbucks has a buyback clause. The big branded companies, a lot of professional services companies, the law firms, the accounting firms, the consultancies, sold to local partners with a buyback clause. I think it's probably worth examining or questioning the durability and the validity of those buyback clauses. They were written in haste. They were written at the beginning of what everyone thought would be a short-term conflict. And anecdotally, entirely anecdotally, what I've heard is a lot of the companies that were sold or reallocated to Russian owners have since taken on a ton of debt. And so who wants to go and buy back a company that's taken on a lot of debt? And we know that this is one thing that Russian companies like to do, is they like to take on debt. There is a new business elite in Russia that is different from the business elite that we're used to. These are, if you take the Forbes 100 list of Russia's wealthiest business people, the top 50, let's say, roughly speaking, are sanctioned. The bottom 50 still has lots of billionaires and lots of multimillionaires. And these are people who have taken these reallocated assets. They've got these shiny new toys, and I don't think they're going to want to give them back. Or if they do, at what cost, politically or financially or economically. While the West was away, non-sanctioning companies came to play. So for everyone who, like all of us, I'm sure, has gone in and out of Moscow and has landed at Sheremetyevo, and you get into your car, your taxi, your marshrutka, whatever, before the express was built, and you're heading down the Leningradka, and you're heading towards Khimki, and you're getting towards the city limits, and the sides of the Leningradka are dotted with car dealerships, right? Toyota, Nissan, Volkswagen, Hyundai, etc. Those car dealerships now are all selling Chinese cars. Craig and I had a little bit of a disagreement on this. Well, we had an interesting discussion on this, a great one, because Craig said it'll take 30 seconds before Russians start to buy Mercedes-Benzes again. And he's probably right, because there will always be a consumer who wants a Mercedes instead of a Chinese car. But there's a consumer who also wanted a Toyota and is probably very happy indeed with their Chinese car. And so these are sort of market share questions that I think are worth asking. Turkey also in consumer goods has replaced a lot of what used to be on the shelves of Russian supermarkets. And finally, in this sub question, I have two more things to talk about. Am I all right?
We're good.
Thank you. Russia's continuing to nationalize enterprises, as we speak, as we sit in this room. Famously, back to airports again, Domodedovo was just nationalized and taken over rather messily. And that further complicates the landscape of going back. We can talk at some point about what Russia's done to its intellectual property law. Russia's drowning in counterfeit Ozempic right now. And so lots of changes on the ground. At a previous book event, I said, yeah, there's counterfeit Ozempic all over Russia. And somebody said, does it work? If you're going, bring back a suitcase, so, we all have our priorities. So the other thing is, does Russia really genuinely want Western investment to come back? So Kirill Dmitriev goes to the first Riyadh meeting. That's interesting. Why do you send the head of your sovereign wealth fund to military, ceasefire talks, right? Well, here's why. So he comes with this report. I know you all know this, but he comes with this report that says that U.S. companies have left $324 billion on the table by having left Russia. And it's energy companies, it's IT companies, it's healthcare, it's consumer goods, media companies. And the idea is that all of this is waiting for you. Come back. And here's $324 billion left on the table. That's all waiting for companies that have the nerve to come back. A moment of rationality here. Maybe it's $324 billion, maybe not. This is kind of pixie dust in the eyes of a very transaction-minded Oval Office. So we'll see. Moreover, how convincingly can Putin do a 180 on 3 years of literally sort of foaming at the mouth anti-Western rhetoric? How do you sort of pivot from enemy countries, enemy companies, hostile nations to all of a sudden, we've got a ceasefire, all's forgiven, come back and do business here? I don't know how you do this. At a previous book event, someone said, look, there's a dial in the Kremlin, and they switch it. It said, hate the West, like the West, hate the West, like the West, in keeping with what is politically expedient at the moment. So, again, a legitimate question, I think, because no matter what the rhetoric is, hate the West, like the West, it would be incautious to assume, back to assumptions, that Putin, for as long as he draws breath, will be anything other than fundamentally hostile towards the West and fundamentally skeptical towards companies that want to do business in Russia. And he's already talked about sort of, welcome back, but we'll probably give you second-class status, deferential to our national champions. Well, some welcome. Okay, we're in the home stretch. And before I wrap up, I just want to mention a few things. This is a general audience book. We are in a specialist audience venue, for which I'm enormously grateful, but it's a general audience book. There is a lighter side to the book. There's a few pages on what it was like taking freelance taxis in Moscow in the early days.
That's a positive sign.
Um, there are pages about what it was like once you got inside some of Moscow's more exclusive nightclubs. These are things that people told me, not things that I experienced myself, for the avoidance of doubt. There's a lot about expat life in the 1800s, in the 1900s, and in the 2000s. I have a little sonnet to Sheremetyevo, the airport that everybody loves to hate. And I had a bit of a go. You know, I live in London now. I used to commute.
Yeah.
There he is.
Yes.
Oh, wow. And there he left. Oh, okay. Craig, hi. Can you hear us?
Loud and clear.
Perfectly. We can see you and hear you also loud and clear. I have about 2 sentences left in my opening remarks.
I've been hearing all of it on the phone. It's been fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very, very much. So yeah, the last thing I was going to do actually was have a go about the commute between Moscow and London for everyone who used to take the British Airways 9:30 departure from Heathrow, whether you're in business class or not. Every single British businessman in that airplane was wearing a suit and tie. But I knew that, that airplane landed with the time zone and the flight time and everything like that, landed at about 4 o'clock, 3:34, 30-ish in Moscow. So by the time you got through passport control, by the time you picked up your luggage, if you had any, by the time you got into a car, you weren't in downtown Moscow until at least, 6 o'clock at the earliest, at the best. But everybody was wearing a suit and tie as if they were going to if there's a meeting being held on the plane, when we knew that nobody was having any meetings that day, and it was always straight to dinner or straight to the bar afterwards. Since I've mentioned straight to the bar, maybe this is a good time to wrap it up and to end. And I will turn it over to Craig. Thank you.
Charles, that was fantastic. And can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. And look, to anyone who hasn't already bought and read the book, go buy it and read it. It's fantastic. While on the one hand, it is aimed at a journalist audience, it's unique. It's on the one hand, an oral history of what happened in the 90s and the noughties and the teens, where Charles has gathered together some of the smartest commentators across not only the Western business, but also the Russian business communities to talk about their trials and tribulations. And then Charles has interlaced it with his own unique insights, and he brings to this not only a Russianist's background, but somebody who was had a front row seat as a journalist in the 1990s. And then I think it's fair to say, Charles, that, with the breadth of your clients in risk management, you've pretty much seen all the good and all the bad that people have experienced in Russia over the years. So as I read this, I felt both nostalgia on the one hand, because, you and I were actually in Leningrad within months of each other back in the early 1980s as language students. We both experienced the tumultuous times of Moscow in the 1990s together. And then, of course, the Sturm und Drang of trying to do business in Russia as well, with all the challenges. And speaking of that British Airways flight, which I know very well, I got a call from BA, and this sort of falls into the relived trauma part of your book, as we all sort of remembered things we would sooner have forgotten. But I got a call from BA one night saying that I might want to go see the doctor and get checked out, because it turned out that the seat I was sitting in on my flight back 2 days before had been used to transport polonium. That was yeah, so they found traces on it. So yeah, anyway. So that was a storied flight. First of all, you brought up so many interesting topics. We could go in so many different directions with it. But I think one of the questions that came up is this question about where are things going now? On the one hand, many people are still licking their wounds from their experience in Russia. Others are saying, yes, Russia is difficult, but we more or less think we've cracked the code and we can make money there if only they will clear away the sanctions. And I tend to see a bit of a spectrum of different risk tolerances. If you are simply selling a service or a good into Russia, then Russia is great because you'll be able to increase your sales of widgets by 5 to 10% this year if the Russian market opens back up again. And you need a sales rep, you need a distribution system, and that's about it. On the other hand, if you're, say, Exxon, and you've taken a $4.5 billion write-down on your Sakhalin project, it's taken years to get up and running, and you're being offered perhaps an opportunity to get back into one of your large Arctic projects, which is a 20-year project, tens of billions of dollars of capital at risk, huge amounts of political risk. Is that something you're going to jump into quickly or not? Plus, sanctions relief is not something you can do with a stroke of the pen. As people often say, it's actually easier to put sanctions on than to take them off. So, for example, most of the sanctions that are in place right now will require at least congressional approval to remove. But in many cases, and we've seen this already in the Black Sea negotiations, simply trying to get the agricultural bank that's involved with grain trading in Russia off the sanctions list and back into SWIFT so it can settle trades requires European consent. And within hours of the Europeans being asked, oh, could you please help out on this deal that we bilaterally agreed with the Russians without you? They said, no, we're not going to until our conditions are met. So it's a complicated, at least 3, maybe 4-way dance going forward. And while we're all, I think, caught up with this sudden pivot or inflection that came more quickly than some thought, when you start looking at it more closely, there are quite a few hurdles to get over, some of them quite significant. Nonetheless, there will be those who have high risk appetites. They'll see cheaply priced debt or what have you, and they'll want to race in and take advantage early. So, but a question to you, Charles, because you were there in the 90s and you saw, that iteration of what might be coming up. Any insights into, things are very different from the early 90s, but on the other hand, we were facing new unknown risks the same way we did back then. What lessons would you share from that time?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Craig. And thank you also for all of the preliminary remarks, especially about sanctions and, about sort of Europe and Europe's reaction opposed to in contrast to what's going on in the US right now. I think, to borrow a phrase, companies that go back to Russia now are not going back to the Russia of the 1990s. This was a time when, plant any seed and it would grow almost. It was a time of, 4-digit margins in financial services and in financial investments, of 2-3-digit margins in consumer goods, and in the professional services world, the revenues were phenomenal. There is one lesson that I hope we take for companies that go back, because there are lots of different. There's going back and there's going back. There are lots of different ways of re-engaging with Russia. And I think there will be some companies that re-engage with Russia in the way that they did business in the 1990s, and that is sort of by long distance. It was only in the 2000s that we saw the building of physical presence and physical plant in Russia from Western companies, and the opening of wholly owned Russian subsidiaries of international companies. I think that because Russia was so dangerous in the 1990s, most companies were putting things in boxes in France and then shipping them to Russia and selling them through local distributors. And that was what they thought, rightly and wrongly, was a good way to do business. Maybe when we go back, when we go back, the lesson to take out of the 1990s is we remember how politically dangerous Russia was at the time. We did business with them. Maybe we can use some of those business models again to do business with Russia from a safe distance. And as you suggest, just put more widgets in boxes, ship them over the border, and you boost your sales margins.
So coming back to Europe for a moment as well, and you have the advantage of sitting in London, so you sort of almost are bestride the Atlantic. My geography is a bit off there, but you mentioned something earlier about whether we need to reconsider, or companies need to reconsider the value requirements that they expect from their partner companies. And I see the point you're making there, but I actually thought you might be heading somewhere else with it. And it's the following. One of the things that I'm interested in as an historian is the historical relationship of trade between Europe and Russia, or I should say the Eastern Slavic lands, because as we all know from our colleagues over at the Ukrainian Research Institute, it was Eastern European trade, the Baltic trade down to the Black Sea, which established the original state in that part of the world, the Kievan dynasty. And European trade played a very important role for a long time. It then sort of disappeared for a few centuries around the time of the Mongol conquest, but then reemerges in the mid 17th, 16th century, rather, when the Muscovy Company is formed. And trade renews, and Russia actually becomes drawn very much into the Atlantic trade, and they're selling raw materials, and they're getting arms in exchange. And that happens for several hundred years. It happens once the oil boom starts in Baku, and it's been largely the pattern up until now, although now they get paid in cash, but they've used much of their surplus cash for rearmament. And from the European point of view, the break in 2022 in many ways is quite historic. We've never seen as thorough a break in trade for centuries, literally, even throughout the Soviet period. Apart from world wars and revolution, there hasn't been that type of full-on break with Russia, and it's quite remarkable. And they're asking questions now of their own companies. Is this good for the broader taxpayer or the citizenship of our country, for us to be buying all these Russian goods if the surpluses that they gain are being used to menace our way of life? So a question is, to what extent is that getting echoed in boardroom discussions? Because that's very much a discussion that you find in capitals and among politicians. But has that sort of made its way yet into the corporate world?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. So Europe remains very firmly in punishment mode when it comes to Russia, and there are no efforts at all yet to normalize, if that's what you want to call sort of President Trump's approach to Russia, trying to normalize relations between the two countries. There is no such effort really at all in Europe. But the European business community is, I feel quite strongly, gagging to get back into Russia. And particularly the German business community. The German business community has long dreamt of a world where business and politics traveled on separate paths. And sort of, we're making washing machines, leave us alone. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a certain risk if there is a sanctions asymmetry between the United States, if sanctions begin to come off here. You're right, though, they're notoriously sticky. But if they start to come off here and they don't come off in Europe, I think that the business community there will take to the street with torches and pitchforks saying, you're treating us prejudicially, even though, there's no great threat coming from, an American trade liberalization, because Europe always did vast multiples more trade with Russia than the Americans. Yeah. What to expect, though, from Russian partners, and also about this break between Europe and Russia, not only was it historic, it was traumatic. And traumatic to the German and the European, the British, the French, the Italian, and the Nordic, which pretty much covers most of it now. The Nordic business communities, this was an historic rupture and an historic and a traumatic break, to the extent that sanctions sometimes punish the sanctioner as much as the sanctionee. That was Europe's story. Russian business partners I think, very badly want to re-engage with Europe. What they all, Sasha Gubsky, who's the editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times now, the publisher of the Moscow Times, but was once the deputy editor-in-chief of Vedomosti, spent a lot of time talking to Russian business people. And to the very last one, this group of men and women told him that all they wanted was an equal seat at the European business table and to create a European business space that included Russia and that they thought would be the strongest economic space in the world. And I think that desire remains. The problem is the political distortion now, and how everything, including the recent reallocation of assets in Russia, took place at the pleasure of the Kremlin. And so, yes, the Russian business people, Craig, as we were talking earlier on the phone, everyone, no one's sending their kids to boarding school in China, and nobody's buying houses, in the south of China. Everybody kind of wants to get back to that BA flight and go back to the UK, go back to France, and re-engage. The political pressure will not let that happen in the way that it was prior to Crimea. Sorry, that's a very long answer to a very short question, but there are no simple answers here.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, the Europeans having stepped away for a while. I mean, I was quite shocked, frankly, that when Moscow started turning off the gas, that the Europeans said, go right ahead, we'll manage without it. And they somehow were nimble and resourceful enough and got lucky with the weather that they were able to get through without even a worse amount, a greater extreme of hardship than they did. And I think that surprised a lot of people. And they have adjusted, and they will look at the Russia opportunity now through very different eyes from how they had before. But I think at the same time, Russia thought that gas was a trump card, that the Europeans would fold if they threatened to turn that gas lever off. And they were quite surprised that that didn't happen. And so it's interesting now to see each side looking at each other to say, well, who really has leverage here? So the Europeans have the capital, the Europeans have the technology, and they are able to substitute the hydrocarbons that they were getting from Russia elsewhere. Oil is pretty much the same cost. Gas is more expensive. That's an issue for some German manufacturers. These are political discussions. But one more thing about the book, the lessons that people would draw from their experience really vary a lot. I mean, we talked a bit about Mike Calvey and his experience, and he's written about that now as well. I'm wondering if there's anybody else out there who has said, this was such a profoundly difficult experience for us that we're going to wait until X happens before we're ready to go in. And how do you define what that X is? I mean, many people say Putin has to go, but could it be something else? And I want to tag one more question on that as well. Do people need to choose between Ukraine and Russia? Russia is kind of Russia because you've been there, but Ukraine also offers a completely new opportunity, unless of course it all gets tied up in an agreement with Washington. That remains to be seen. But can you talk a little bit about that as well, the Ukraine versus Russia dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So what is the X that what is the trigger? What's the X that has to happen that will get companies to go back? A slightly sort of slippery answer to begin with, and that is that it's genuinely different for different companies, depending upon their risk appetite, depending upon their sector, and also depending on the regulatory environment in their home jurisdictions. I think that was a driver of company behavior that I failed to appreciate sufficiently until I started reporting for the book. And that is that there are companies whose footprints were larger and a bit more flexible in Russia, than others. And that was a reflection, I think, of what they feared or didn't fear in their home jurisdictions. And I think that will remain relevant to who goes back and who doesn't. And I think a lot of companies will actually be asking for one of the X's that might have to happen is they'll be asking for political cover. Will the White House, will the EU, will Number 10, will Berlin have their companies' backs if they go back to Russia? I think the answer to that question is no. But I think companies will wish that they had it. And I wonder who's going to be able to access and afford political risk insurance to go back to Russia in any capacity. So those are a couple of X's there. We're focusing a lot on sanctions relief. And for a lot of companies, that will be the green light. But they'll be mistaken if that's the only trigger for their return. Because, in addition to this notion of IP protection, changes to the tax code, changes to the customs code, the new business elite that I mentioned, and then also the labor issue in Russia. Who's going to work in or for all of these Western companies if and when they go back? And even if their requirements for employees are modest because they're not going back bigly, it used to be in the 1990s, Craig, you'll remember this. It was a point of pride, to get a job in a Western company. Mommy, I got a job with Microsoft. No one's going to say that. Who's going to rush to get a job with Microsoft in Russia now? I wonder about that. So, the X's are a lot. You need intellectual property. You need changes to the tax code. You need changes to the customs code to crack down on parallel imports. Just so many things need to change. Companies that underestimate that list will find themselves, I think, in difficult situations fairly early on. On Russia and Ukraine, this is something that came up in the chat with students this afternoon. There is the famous sort of Ukraine Rebuilding Conference that's once a year in London. There are conferences in Berlin on this subject. I think there have been some in the US. Risk consultancies that I know have opened offices in Kiev. This all depends really on, well, a few things. Of course, first of all, a durable, reliable ceasefire. It would be nice if some Russian central bank assets perhaps were reallocated towards Ukrainian reconstruction. That would be very helpful. But the question about, well, how will Ukraine look on companies that come to rebuild Ukraine but also go into Russia? How will Russia look at companies that come back to Russia but also engage on the ground in Ukraine? I wonder, we talked about that this afternoon, are those two formulas, are they mutually exclusive? Can you really do that? And I'd like to be a fly on the wall in the boardrooms that make those decisions. Who's going to value, what's the size of the prize in Ukraine? What's the size of the prize in Russia? And who's going to make their decisions to either try to balance both or to choose one over the other? Because I think it could become very, very tricky to try to do both at the same time.
Yeah.
Shall we open up to our audience? We're gonna open up to questions to the audience. Thank you so much, Craig, for those fascinating insights and questions. Mikhail, I think I saw you raising your hand.
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick questions. Thank you for your fascinating talk, and I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
I just wanted to kind of examine this moment of reckoning that you mentioned. Someone was saying that the moment of reckoning goes back to 1994. So people in 22 would say, well, we should have been wiser, listening to Wayne May, which looks to me a little bit like hypocritical stance. Have you ever seen, Western businesses who made plenty of money in Russia say we actually regret making that money in 2019, 2020, because it was definitely, the path to war, as we know in hindsight. We are wise in hindsight. So anyone ever mentioned that to you? And then secondly, and more practically, again, it's probably in the book, but what's the actual scale of exodus of even US companies from Russia? Because I mean, it looks like almost common wisdom now that out of like 6,000, about 1,500 only left and others are there. So are those unimportant companies, they are not high profile, or they are just, making profits without, raising their head above water. And then finally, so do you think that the Kremlin is really serious about wanting those companies back? As long as what we are hearing, even from someone like Kirill Dmitriev, who is supposed to kind of be favorable to the return, it sounds really like trolling. Like he's saying, oh, look, we have cutting edge technologies for liquefied natural gas in the Arctic. And I mean, I got messages from energy analysts saying, is he okay? So whom is he? And then, this figure 342 billion, right? It kind of is close to 350 billion that, Donald Trump believes. So it looks, and then, and other things, obviously, like, the US companies would be allowed to sell gas from, Primorsk on entry to Nord Stream 2 and then resell it to Germany. I mean, cut all the traders out of business, Russian traders, doesn't look, risky. So, anything you could.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. So on the moment of reckoning thing, just very briefly, look, there are people in the book who say, I saw this coming from the very beginning. And I knew that Putin was bad news from day one. And I watched all of these red flags come and go, and I was very careful about this. Most people paid more attention to quarterly and annual results than to political or geopolitical red flags. And that's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. Does anyone regret making the money that they made in Russia when business was good? No. There is some reflection in the book that says, we helped to bring the situation to where it is today. And maybe if we had it to do all over again, we would do it differently. But does anybody regret? I don't think so. And in fact, at a previous book event, somebody said, oh, did you ask anyone in the book? Did you say, if you knew what would happen now, would you have gone into Russia in 1990? And actually, that was a really good question that I didn't think of asking. But companies don't think that way, actually. They think, and Craig and I talked about this. I hope he's still online. Craig and I talked about this and at Craig's suggestion, these are his very, very intelligent pieces of analysis, not mine, that, in the private equity sector, you have people investing over 5, 7, 10, 15 years and look at Russia in one way. In consumer goods, you have people who are looking at quarterly results, annual results, and the expat staff is moved on after 2 years anyway. And those are two very different sort of ways of looking at what happens in a country. So the first answer is no. What was the scale of the exodus? You're absolutely right to point out that lots of companies stayed. That was for a number of reasons. First of all, the longer the war went on and with the forming of the State Commission on exiting Russia, the harder it got to leave. One. Two, a lot of the companies that stayed, it wasn't worth the expense of leaving. And these are companies for who their turnover in Russia for the rest of, on a global basis was small, insignificant. Wrapping up a company in Russia is very, very painful. And so a lot of companies decided, well, let's just stay there and we'll just sort of let it ride and not go through this awful process of exiting. And then for the bigger companies that did stay, the Burger Kings and the sort of Mondelez and Pepsi, there's a quote in the FT that I carefully attributed, but put in the book, where the CEO of Mondelez, which makes Oreo cookies, right? You can buy an Oreo cookie in Russia, but you can't buy a Ritz cracker, I think. No, Ritz cracker is the same company. Anyway, he said, our shareholders don't care if we're in Russia or not. It was a small amount of their business. They say that they're not investing in Russia. They're not doing a lot of sales and marketing. They're not hiring. Raiffeisen kind of was like, ignoring all of the calls from the Federal Reserve and the SEC and the Treasury to leave, and from the European Central Bank to get out. They've scaled back, but they haven't left. And this is the thing about sort of who looks smart now, who left and who stayed. But you're right to point out that lots and lots and lots of companies stayed. And then, does the Kremlin really want companies back? Yeah, it probably does. I think it's just under what terms and conditions. And I think the terms and conditions, again, it's not like the 1990s, not even like the 2000s. I keep pointing to Daniel because he's written a great book on the topic. And, you know, I think that there is a use for Western companies in Russia to fill technological and sort of mechanical gaps that may or may not have been closed in their absence. But I think it will be under much more restrictive terms than ever before. You still have a very puzzled look on your face. Is that, did I answer? Was that? Okay, next.
Thank you so much. I guess building on that question, another very important thing that happened in 2014 that kind of shaped the relationship of Western companies with Russia outside of Crimea was the UCOS arbitral award and the fact that they refused kind of to honor that exit negative award. So my question is, how do you, as kind of relationship with Russia evolve, especially with Western companies, how do you see the Kremlin's relationship or in terms of honoring these, you know, like Western arbitral, Western investment protection institutions? Or, you know, there's a lot of talks about China potentially rising as a new arbitral center, or like other places in the world. Like, I'm just curious about what will protect investors going into Russia in terms of expropriation risk and other types.
Yeah, very little. So, you know, the story with arbitration in Russia was that it was always done in a reliable Western transparent jurisdiction, and then you would bring your award back to Russia and never be able to enforce it. The next step is that Russia is saying no more international arbitration, that all arbitration's got to take place inside Russia, in Russian courts with Russian awards, and if you don't like it, you know, get out. I'm not aware of what's happening in China, but you know, to insert British or Swiss or Swedish arbitration into your contract for a safety valve in Russia in case things go wrong, I think that's over.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to make a question so much as an intervention following up.
Oh dear.
on that.
Okay.
Things are going to be more restricted. I ran the Russia-Ukraine program at the National Endowment for Democracy for about 12 years. The Kremlin has at its disposal a very wide range of ways of sort of keeping any foreign organization within limits. I think that the notorious OVIR, the Odolenie Viz I Registracji, is going to start playing a very much bigger role for foreign businessmen. I think the days of the multi-year, multi-entry, multi-exit visa are gone. You'll have to start, you know, everything that you do will have to have a much clearer and much more much clearer and much more sort of narrow definition. When you come into Russia, it's going to have to be for a specific, well-defined purpose, announced in advance, so that you can probably be monitored while you're doing it. You may have people that you were strongly encouraged to hire in your companies. At the same time, you may find it difficult to get certain types of people to work in your company. Yeah, you may find it difficult to get certain types of people to work in your country, certain types of information that are necessary for, say, manufacturing, such as water quality, the capacity of the electrical grid. These may, going back to Soviet practices, these may now be considered, sensitive information. So I think it's going to be way more difficult just in the practical day-to-day aspects.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is to that point of leverage. I mean, all the way down to sort of whether and what kind of visa you get. I completely agree. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the work. I find it to be a highly engaging read.
Thank you.
Aspects of the history that you outlined following the collapse of the Soviet Union and Western companies coming into Russia, the power dynamic was very much in favor of the investors that were coming into the market. But a short time after that, it really began to change more for the Russian power centers and authorities. I wonder if you could talk more a little bit about how and why that happened.
Oof, yeah, okay, so, well, initially, I mean, why did we all sort of rush in there? This was a period of rapid globalization. Um, and companies were doing business in places that previously they had considered too distant, too opaque, too risky, too dangerous. Suddenly the world was changing and, we could go to places like Russia. And we had this great rebranding of, countries that we used to call third world markets. Third world countries, we started to call emerging markets. Emerging markets are investable. Third world countries are not investable. They were the same place. But more to your point, so then what happened was, whether this was diplomatic language or whether it was sincere, our political leadership in Western Europe and the United States told us to go to Russia, engage, get on the ground, invest in Russia under this kind of convergence theory sort of outlook. Why did this with Western companies? I mean, I think back to the days, while I was researching the book and also in person in the 90s, Credit Suisse came first because Credit Suisse had a voracious appetite for risk and was led by a very charismatic individual who said, let's go. And of course, this was during privatization. And privatization was a bonanza for companies and for individuals and for organizations that had the technical expertise to sort of create. One of the stories I enjoyed the most of telling and reporting was the creation of the Russian securities market. And that's where, Alexandra was enormously helpful, and Rawi was enormously helpful. All of, the people that I interviewed in the academic community who were there. And so there was that expertise in Western financial services companies. And then I think, the question in the book, were Russians ever capitalists? And personally, I hate painting with a broad brush and saying Russians were this or Russians were that. I think that's unfair and I try to avoid it. But I think that there was a skill set that was slowly developed in the Russian financial services, the emerging Russian financial services sector, that also began to perform well on that market with the help of some expats also. Then there was also kind of the political aspect, the beginning of sort of oligarchic capitalism, and the use and abuse of political connections to distort the development of the Russian financial services sector, in favor perhaps away from the West. And ultimately, I think at the end, my feeling was that in the late 1990s, before the crash, and then in the 2000s, the West was a significant player in Russian financial services. But sitting in London, it was became more just a facilitator for what was happening, I think, on the ground in Moscow in Russian circles. And I think that was an evolution that started in the 1990s, was interrupted by the crisis of 98, and then carried on a little bit later.
Can I interject?
Yes, please do. People have questions, by all means ask your questions, but let's have a conversation.
This particular topic. So I wrote a book where I interviewed people who were active in Russia in the 1990s, including around formation of financial markets. And so one of the things that they talked about was that with the formation of the privatization led to the formation of the stock exchanges. And what that was really about is how do you allocate capital as opposed to a planned economy, which allocated it all from the top. And so the belief on the Western side was that it would come to mirror how capital is allocated in the US or in global. So the share market, share exchanges, stock exchanges, private equity. But that's not what happened, because Russians never really, it was foreigners who were buying the shares and trading the shares and looking for undervalued assets that they could get some control over. The Russians, it became a conflict between share ownership and banks. The Russian oligarchs all had pocket banks. And they allocated capital through the banking system, not through shares. And when they privatized, the crown jewels were never privatized. The first privatization was 15,000 companies and the Soviet enterprises, but that didn't include the natural resources. And those were only privatized in 1996 as the loans for shares. And foreigners were excluded from that program, except for Harvard and which is another story, and Soros. But ultimately, the share market ideology lost. The allocation of capital came to be through banks, and the banks were controlled by oligarchic groups, and then later put in their place by Putin by 2004, 2005, in which they were told, you do business, stay out of politics, I run politics. And that process, really, you could tell, I mean, through the interviews, that's what people talked about. I mean, I talked to Boris Jordan and about the early days and formation of Renaissance Capital and Troika and all these banks, UFG, these are the private equity groups, including, by the way, that's where Kirill Dmitriev got his start at Delta Capital with Pat Clardy. This is where he learned, his finance. So this was, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but this is a kind of a dynamic that I think answers what you were asking.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I'm a recovering journalist, I now work at the data center, but I was in Moscow from 96 to 06, and then again from 2012 to 2015. And what I would add is I think that, so Daniel has described the capital. So before the money was with the Westerners, and then there were sort of indigenous sources of wealth generation. That's one thing. Then, of course, Putin established what was then called the vertical structure of power, where in the early 2000s, he, there used to be a very fragmented political decision-making set up with each region having its own kind of interests and governors that were quite powerful. And he put the kibosh on that, and he started appointing governors. So he really consolidated political, because you were asking about leverage, right? So the money became indigenous, the governance, sort of the political will became centralized. And I think also like amid that, there was the skills transfer, whereas before, and there's this wonderful anecdote, I don't remember, I brought it up at your talk, I don't remember which of the early 90s Americans working in Moscow relayed this anecdote of coming to Putin and trying to get a contract for something, and Putin was very weary. He was in St. Petersburg as a trade official then, and he says, listen, I'll do it because we need money, we don't have money. The Westerners do have money, so I'll give you your permission because we need the money. When we have the money, we'll be calling the shots. So he was very, very pragmatic and straight about it even then. And so gradually, as the capital state, the political consolidation, and the skills transfer from Westerners to locals who just learned to do everything that the Western companies were doing.
Right. By 1998, the skills transfer were there. By 1998, in the crisis, all the foreigners left.
Yeah.
And the expats left, and they came back.
Yeah.
But by then, Russians had started taking their place and had some of those skills that you were.
And even created more efficient and effective hybrid mechanisms that were suited to that reality. You need cash in some cases.
Question here.
Thank you.
Hi, Nadia.
Great to see you,
Hi.
Charles, and thank you so much. Fascinating as always.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned that no one ever regretted the monies that they've made in Russia.
Gosh, maybe I should have been a little bit more conditional on that, but
So, I mean, we don't know, firstly, how this peace deal will play out and what would be the terms and conditions. And even if there will be a peace deal in place, Putin does not really have a strong track record of abiding by these terms and conditions. So it's a highly uncertain environment, and no company, I think, can be sure that the risks will be any lower when they will decide to re-enter the Russian market. So morals aside, from purely political, economic risk perspective, is it even worth it for them to go back to Russian market, given that, this peace deal may crumble in a
Yeah.
months? We are not even talking about 10, 15 years perspective. And second question, when it comes to, you've talked a lot about Russian businesses, Western businesses going back to Russian market, but what about other way around? So most likely sanctions won't be released on the individuals that have already been sanctioned. But what about these new elites, the oligarchs? Do you think there will be much incentive for them to go back into the UK or other European markets? And what can the Western governments do to somehow at least control this desire?
And can I add a mini question to that question, which my question is, are the new business elites powerful enough to help keep out the return of the American countries because they have taken the space that was left empty by the American departure?
These are great questions. Craig, help me. So here's a couple. I'll get some answers out of the way, and then I would very much like our discussant, our moderator, to also offer his view. Is it worth it? So there has, again, slightly slippery answer here because every company will make that decision independently. But what we have seen is a complete recalculation or recalibrating of the risk-reward equation. And the reward is smaller. I think you kind of have to assume that going back to Russia, the reward is smaller, the risk is higher. This will still suit some companies. For other companies, this may be the ones who said to me, never again. That's probably part of that calculation. Russians coming to the West, the other way around, and what can Western governments do to control that? Speaking for somebody who has a lot of friends and did a lot of work in the city of London, very little. London welcomed Russian capital with open arms always. The banks, the law firms, the PR firms, the real estate agencies, the auction houses, you name it. There were very little breaks on all of that. And again, the government. So there's an anecdote in the book. After the illegal annexation of Crimea, there's a dinner in the British Embassy residence hosted by the ambassador with Western and Russian business people invited to dinner. And after the invasion and the annexation of Crimea, the ambassador is saying, please come list on the London Stock Exchange. So, that kind of says it all from somebody who was at the dinner. I think Russians will have to come to the West because this is where the expertise, the depth of the capital markets, the banks, the exchanges, the resources, that's where it is. And I think that's also what they want to do. Are the new business elites powerful enough to keep out Western business? There will be. For example, there is a group of business elites right now who want none of this to happen whatsoever, and that's the military-industrial complex, who don't even want the war to stop, let alone Western businesses coming back in. And this is a powerful group of individuals who have no interest in any change to the status quo. Beyond that, I think that the answer to your question is also probably yes. I think maybe it's not an either or, but a sort of, controlled and under, again, T's and C's, what's the groundwork for that return? And I think that will be very, very carefully calibrated. I don't think companies are going to be welcomed back with open arms. Craig, do you?
I would just add two things. I think where Russia can get by without it, they would prefer not to have Western companies or Western capital. They very much want to build whatever you want to call the economic system in one country. The problem they face is that they've allowed themselves to become slaves to a hydrocarbon economy. And they're dealing with a resource base which is becoming increasingly complex to develop. And try as they might over the years to develop the domestic expertise to be able to do LNG, to be able to develop complex field, to be able to do complex reservoir modeling. They simply cannot begin to match the expertise that was being provided by high-end Western engineering companies and oilfield service companies. And it's showing for anybody who follows the sector closely, you're seeing deterioration in quality, you're seeing costs going up. So there are certain areas where they just need the technology and the expertise. That doesn't necessarily come from an oil major. It's more likely to come from an engineering firm and an oilfield services company. Same thing happens for the refineries as well. Much of the refinery upgrades that happened over the last 25, 30 years that have now been destroyed either through attrition or through drone strikes, that was all Western kit. And it's not something you can get the Chinese to do for you because they don't have that kit, nor do they have the expertise in the oil and gas side either. And so there are certain areas where Russia will need, because of the model that they have, if they want to maintain efficiencies, to bring that back in. The second thing is just capital, depth of capital, and you mentioned that already. But when you look at the numbers, the Western capital markets are just massive. The debt markets are huge. Russia has been closed off from them. And what's happened? A double-A Russian company is now borrowing at 25%, a triple-B Russian company at north of 30%, because capital has become very scarce because they've been cut off from the Western capital system. I mean, there are more complexities going on than that as well. But and this goes back literally decades, if not centuries. Technology, capital, two things that Russia simply has not been able to develop in sufficient amounts domestically. But thirdly is premium markets, because it's an export business, it's an export country first and foremost. And yes, India is buying their oil, but they're getting $12 to $15 less per barrel today when they ship to India compared to if they were selling in Amsterdam or Hamburg. You've got the freight costs, you've got the special discounts that the Indians can squeeze out of them because they're the buyers of last resort. And this is really painful for a country which, again, is heavily reliant on hydrocarbons. And, gas, I mean, they've lost 110, 120 BCM a year of, it says $40 to $50 billion of gas revenues. And you can't send that stuff to China. There's no infrastructure and there's not the demand. So, yeah, we don't want Europe, but we can't do without them in the long term.
There were some other questions.
We're going to one more question,
Okay.
gentleman here.
All right. When you talk about the financial services and banking in Russia, my question is, do they really know the risk profile of the country? In terms of exchange rate risk, currency risk, everything is so risky over there. And how could they get the money back when they lend the money to Russia, for example, the credit risk?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is something where Craig will also have a few really good things to say. My view on the financial services sector is that I think they know the risk profile of the places that they do business extremely well. I think they're smart organizations. I really do. And I know that they have internal and external country risk experts who provide them with, the latest information. And, do they listen to it? Not always. But they know. I think they do know what they're doing. I think that these are just companies, these are organizations with bottomless appetites for risk. And we're seeing that now. There's been some stuff in the press lately about the return of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs to doing some trades in Russian debt and in Russian shares in, companies that are, and debt that's currently undervalued because it's sanctioned in anticipation of a spike in that value if there's sanctions relief. And the trades are being executed. The platform is being provided by Western banks. That's a little bit safer than being a party to the transaction. But will we see HSBC and Citibank, go back? They had already left. They'd begun exiting before any of the geopolitical issues arose. Either exiting from corporate banking, or exiting from retail banking, or exiting from different offerings on the market. Will Raiffeisen let them back in? I don't know. Sorry, that's a little bit of a silly thing to say. Craig?
I would just say we're going to see a lot of headlines that suggest the banks are going back in. But when we talk about the JP Morgan and the Goldman Sachs transactions, we're looking at very high risk traders dealing in illiquid secondary market debt that's deeply distressed, thinking that they're, if things go well, they can sell it to someone else. That's not investing in Russia. That's not financing Russian companies. That's just trading speculatively in very high risk debt on a very small scale. Compare that to Russia at its heyday. I think the last transaction I worked on in Russia before the Crimean invasion, $40 billion financing, right? You're not going to see anything like that anytime soon. But it was possible at that point. But banks aren't going to touch Russia risk. Banks simply don't have the lines of exposure, and it will take many years of very good behavior by Russian corporates for that type of exposure to come back. Now, here's the thing, the interesting lesson that I think Russia learned after 2014, because all my Russian friends kind of said, fine, you guys are going to not lend to us anymore, but we'll go to the Middle East, we'll go to China. They have lots of money, which they do. However, they lend in a very different way, and they have a very different skill set. Their lending is primarily domestic, or it's specifically for big projects involving their companies abroad. The West uniquely has a risk capital function where you have people who simply scrub down a company in and out and say, we like you, here's capital, use it well, pay us back properly. So but that takes a very refined set of skills that have been built up over many, many decades that simply aren't there with Middle East and Chinese capital, at least when it comes to markets like Russia.
I would say good luck. I worked in China for a very long time. China, Hong Kong, and USA, and very good luck. In 1997 financial crisis, shock Asia, and then Russia, right? And Argentina. And all these banks are in big trouble in terms of credit risk and liquidity risk. And in the past several years, I don't see how could they get the money back. And even though it's a lot of Chinese capital going in, yes, going to one Belt One Road, I have done a lot of Belt Road initiative deals when I was in Hong Kong. I can tell you that I would say a lot of those deals can never be recovered.
Yeah. So interesting.
$1 trillion in those countries. I did a lot of deals in Africa, Latin America. I would say not more than 20% is recoverable.
Yeah.
But those money they borrow from the international financial institutions. They lend the money to Brazil, Argentina, Kazakhstan. Good luck.
Your next book.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for the book idea. Yeah.
Join me in thanking Charles and Craig for their time today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you for joining us online, and on your way out, make sure to pick up a copy of Zero Sum. Have a great night.
Thank you very much.